They called her enemy for helping a child. The Apache Warrior saw the mother she could be. Chapter 1. The choice that changed everything. The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty plains as Ayanna crouched behind a cluster of mesquite bushes, her heart pounding against her rib. The acrid smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood that stained the earth around the overturned wagon. Bodies lay scattered across the settlement's outskirts, men, women, and warriors alike, victims of another brutal clash between her Comanche band and the encroaching settlers. But it was the sound that made her freeze, a soft, trembling whimper coming from beneath the wagon's canvas covering. Ayanna's weathered hands, marked by years of survival in the harsh frontier, slowly pulled back the blood-soaked fabric. There, curled into a ball, was a little girl no older than 5 winters. Her blonde hair was matted with dirt and tears, her blue eyes wide with terror as she stared up at the Comanche woman who had found her. The child's dress, once white with tiny flowers, was now torn and stained, and her small body shook uncontrollably. "Please," the little girl whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that whistled through the canyon wall. "Please don't hurt me." Ayanna felt something crack inside her chest, a wall she had built around her heart after losing her own daughter to fever 3 winters ago. The child's frightened face transformed before her eyes, becoming the face of little Chenoa, her own precious girl who had died in her arms, calling for her mother with her last breath. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Her war party would return soon, and they would not show mercy to any survivor. In their eyes, this child represented everything they fought against: the destruction of their way of life, the theft of their ancestral lands, the broken promises of the white man's government. But looking into those terrified blue eyes, Ayanna saw only innocence. She saw a child who had done nothing wrong, who deserved a chance to live, to grow, to become more than a casualty of this endless cycle of violence and revenge. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of her brother's war cries as they finished their grim work. Time was running out. "Do not make a sound," Ayanna whispered in broken English, her voice rough from years of speaking primarily in Comanche. She lifted the trembling child into her arms, feeling the girl's small body press against her chest. "I will not hurt you, little one, but you must be brave." Moving with the silent grace of a seasoned warrior, Ayanna carried the child away from the carnage, her moccasins making no sound on the rocky ground. She knew a place, a hidden cave about 2 miles north, where water seeped from the rocks and wild berries grew in the shadows. It would be safe there at least for a few days. As she walked, the child's grip tightened around her neck, and Ayanna found herself humming an old Comanche lullaby, the same one she had sung to Chenoa during those long, cold nights when illness had ravaged their camp. The melody seemed to calm the little girl, and gradually her trembling subsided. "What is your name?" Ayanna asked softly as they reached the cave entrance. "Mary," the child whispered, her voice still shaky but no longer filled with pure terror. "Mary Elizabeth Connor." "Mary," Ayanna repeated, tasting the foreign name on her tongue. "You are safe now, Mary. I promise you this." But even as she spoke the words, Ayanna knew that her promise would come at a terrible cost. By saving this child, she had made a choice that would mark her as a traitor to her own people. The penalty for such betrayal was exile, or worse. As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of deep red and gold, Ayanna settled into the cave with Mary curled against her side. The child had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by fear and trauma, her small hand clutching Ayanna's buckskin dress. In the distance, smoke rose from the settlement, and the faint sound of her war party celebration echoed across the plain. They would discover her absence soon enough, and when they did, they would come looking for answers. Ayanna closed her eyes and listened to Mary's steady breathing, feeling a peace she hadn't known since Chenoa's death. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like a mother again. Whatever came next, whatever price she would have to pay, this moment of maternal protection felt worth it. The stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky, each one a silent witness to the choice that would change everything. Ayana had chosen compassion over loyalty, love over hatred, and in doing so, she had set in motion a series of events that would reshape not just her own destiny, but the fate of everyone whose lives she would touch. Tomorrow, she would face the consequences of her decision. Tonight, she would simply hold this frightened child and remember what it felt like to be needed, to be someone's protector, to be a mother once again. Chapter 2. The Price of Compassion. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as Ayana approached on foot, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had done. 3 days had passed since she had hidden Mary in the cave, and the child was now safely on her way to the nearest fort, carried by a kind-hearted trader who had promised to see her to safety. The silence that greeted her return was more ominous than any war cry. Warriors who had fought beside her for years now turned their backs as she passed, their faces carved from stone. Children who had once run to her with bright smiles now hid behind their mother's skirts, whispering words she couldn't quite hear but understood all the same. Chief Paha, a man whose weathered face bore the scars of countless battles, stood waiting for her at the center of the camp. His eyes, once filled with the warmth of paternal affection, now held the cold judgment of tribal law. Beside him stood the council of elders, their expressions grave and unyielding. "You know why we have gathered," Paha said, his voice carrying across the silent camp. Every member of the band had come to witness this moment, the reckoning that would determine Ayana's fate. "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She had known this moment would come from the instant she had lifted Mary from beneath that wagon. The choice had been hers, and now she would face the consequences. 3 warriors saw you," Paha continued, his words deliberate and measured. "They saw you carry the white child away from the battle. They saw you save the life of our enemy while your own brothers lay dead on the ground." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, anger, disappointment, and betrayal mixing into a chorus of condemnation. Ayana felt each whispered word like a physical blow, but she stood straight, her shoulders squared. "The child had done nothing wrong," she said, her voice carrying despite its softness. "She was innocent, innocent." The word came from Running Bear, a young warrior whose brother had been killed by settler bullets just 2 moons ago. "The white man's spawn is never innocent. They grow up to steal our land, to kill our children, to destroy everything we hold sacred." "She was a child," Ayana repeated, her voice growing stronger. "No older than 5 winters. She had not chosen to be born into this war. And yet you chose her life over the lives of your own people," Paha said, his words cutting through the morning air like a blade. "You chose to show mercy to our enemies while your own brother's blood soaked the earth." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, more hostile. Ayana could see the pain in their faces, the accumulated grief of years of conflict, the anger of a people watching their way of life disappear beneath the wheels of progress and the boots of settlers. She understood their rage, even as she stood accused of betraying it. "I lost my daughter," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I lost Chenoa to the fever, and I have carried that pain every day since. When I saw that child, I saw—" She paused, struggling to find words that could make them understand. "I saw a mother's love. I saw what we all claim to fight for, the right to protect our children." "You saw weakness," spat Running Bear. "You saw the soft heart of a woman who has forgotten she is a warrior." "I saw humanity," Ayana replied, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I saw the chance to break the cycle of hatred that has consumed us all." Chief Paha raised his hand for silence, and the crowd fell still. The weight of leadership sat heavy on his shoulders, and Ayana could see the internal struggle playing out across his weathered features. He had known her since she was a child, had watched her grow into a fierce warrior, had mourned with her when Chenoa died. "The law is clear," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "To aid our enemies is to betray our people. To betray our people is to forfeit your place among us." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ayana felt her knees threaten to buckle, but she forced herself to remain standing. She had known this would be the outcome, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that preparation could not. "You are no longer Comanche," Paha continued, each word cutting deeper than the last. You are no longer our sister, our daughter, our friend. You are cast out, to wander the wilderness alone, carrying the shame of your betrayal until the day you die. The finality of the pronouncement settled over the camp like a burial shroud. Ayana looked around at the faces of people who had been her family, her entire world, and saw only strangers. The bonds that had held her to this life were severed as surely as if they had been cut with a blade. You have until sunset to gather your belongings and leave, Paha said, his voice softer now, tinged with the sorrow of a man who had just lost someone he loved. If you are found on Comanche land after dark, you will be treated as an enemy. As the crowd began to disperse, Ayana stood alone in the center of the camp that had been her home for 32 years. The weight of her isolation pressed down on her like a physical force, threatening to crush her spirit entirely. But as she walked toward her lodge to gather her few possessions, she thought of Mary's face, the terror that had transformed into trust, the small arms that had clung to her neck, the peaceful sleep of a child who felt safe. In that moment, despite everything she had lost, Ayana knew she had made the right choice. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon as she loaded her few belongings onto her horse. A water skin, some jerky, her weapons, and a small bundle of herbs. Everything she owned in the world could fit in a single pack. As she rode away from the only home she had ever known, Ayana didn't look back. Behind her lay the ashes of her old life, the family that had disowned her, the identity that had been stripped away. Ahead lay the unknown wilderness, vast and unforgiving, where survival would depend on strength, cunning, and the will to continue living when everything familiar had been lost. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried its lonely call. Ayana pulled her horse to a stop and listened to the sound, feeling an unexpected kinship with the solitary hunter. Like her, it was alone in the vastness of the frontier, surviving on its own terms. She clicked her tongue and urged her horse forward into the gathering dusk and toward an uncertain future. Behind her, the smoke from her former camp's fires disappeared into the darkening sky, carrying with it the last remnants of the life she had chosen to leave behind. Chapter 3. Alone. In the wilderness, 6 months had passed since Ayana's exile, and the harsh Texas wilderness had become both her enemy and her reluctant teacher. The abandoned line shack she had claimed as shelter sat in a narrow canyon, its weathered walls providing meager protection from the elements. What had once been a temporary refuge for cattle drivers was now her entire world, 20 feet of rotting wood and rusted tin, surrounded by miles of unforgiving terrain. The morning sun filtered through the gaps in the roof, casting dancing shadows across the dirt floor where she knelt, grinding mesquite beans into flour. Her hands, once soft despite years of warrior training, were now calloused and scarred from the constant struggle for survival. Every meal was a victory. Every day she woke alive was a triumph against the odds. But it was the loneliness that proved the most difficult enemy to defeat. At least the coyotes sing to each other, she murmured to herself, a habit she had developed to fill the oppressive silence. Her voice sounded foreign in the empty space, roughened by months of disuse, except for these solitary conversations. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze, her hand instinctively moving to the knife at her belt. In the months since her exile, she had encountered few humans, and those meetings had rarely ended well. Word of her presence had spread through the scattered settlements and ranches, carried by whispered rumors and fearful speculation. They called her the Apache ghost in the nearby towns, though she was Comanche, not Apache. The distinction didn't matter to frightened settlers who saw only a dangerous Indian woman living alone in the wilderness. Some claimed she was a witch who could curse livestock and spoil crops. Others whispered that she was a cannibal who fed on the flesh of lost travelers. The truth was far more mundane. She was simply a woman trying to survive in a world that had no place for her. Through the cracked window, she watched as 3 riders approached the shack. Their faces were hard, their clothes dusty from long days in the saddle. She recognized their type immediately: bounty hunters, drifters, men who made their living from violence and had no qualms about targeting a woman alone. "We know you're in there, Indian," one of them called out, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "Come out with your hands where we can see them." Ayana remained still, her breathing controlled and silent. She had learned to read men like these in the months since her exile, their motivations, their fears, their weaknesses. They were predators, but they were also cowards, reluctant to face true danger when easier prey was available. "Maybe she ain't home, Cole," suggested the second rider, a younger man with nervous eyes that darted constantly around the canyon walls. "Horse is still here," Cole replied, dismounting with the confidence of a man who had done this many times before. "And these tracks are fresh. She's holed up in there like a cornered rat." They spread out, surrounding the shack with practiced efficiency. Ayana watched them through the gaps in the walls, counting their weapons, noting their positions, calculating her chances. 3 men, all armed with rifles and revolvers. She had her knife, her bow, and the element of surprise. "Last chance, squaw," Cole called out, his voice now directly outside the door. "Come out peaceful, and we might let you live long enough to tell us where you've hidden whatever you've stolen." The assumption that she was a thief sparked a familiar anger in Ayana's chest. In their minds, her very existence was a crime worthy of violence. She was guilty of being Indian, of being alone, of refusing to disappear quietly into the wilderness and die. "I have stolen nothing," she called back, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "I want no trouble with you." Cole's laughter was harsh and without humor. "Trouble? Lady, you are trouble. $300 for your scalp, dead or alive. That's more than most men make in a year." The bounty on her head was news to Ayana, though it explained the increasing frequency of unwanted visitors. Someone wanted her dead badly enough to pay handsomely for it, and she could guess who. The territorial government had been cracking down on hostile Indians, and her reputation as a dangerous outcast made her a convenient target. "I'll make you a deal," Cole continued, his voice moving closer to the door. "You come out now and I'll make it quick. Won't even take your hair. What do you say?" Ayana closed her eyes and thought of Mary, the little girl whose life had cost her everything. Was this how it would end? Gunned down in a filthy shack by men who saw her as nothing more than a payday? The door exploded inward with a crash, and Cole stepped through with his rifle raised, but the shack was empty, save for the lingering scent of sage and the cold ashes of a long-dead fire. "Where the hell?" he began, but his words were cut short as Ayana dropped from the rafters above, her knife sliding between his ribs with surgical precision. The fight was brief and brutal. Years of warrior training, sharpened by months of desperate survival, made her movements fluid and deadly. When the dust settled, 2 of the bounty hunters lay dead, and the third was fleeing across the desert, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of dust in his desperate retreat. Ayana stood in the doorway of her ruined shelter, breathing hard, her clothes stained with blood that wasn't her own. The silence that followed the violence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat and the distant cry of a circling vulture. She looked down at Cole's body, seeing not a man, but a symbol of everything her life had become. Violence, isolation, the constant struggle just to exist. This was her reality now, not the noble warrior she had once been, but a hunted animal fighting for survival in an increasingly hostile world. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the canyon floor, Ayana began the grim work of disposal. She couldn't leave the bodies here. They would bring more hunters, more violence, more death. The desert would claim them, as it claimed everything else that couldn't adapt to its merciless demand. But as she worked, dragging the corpses toward a distant ravine, a new sound reached her ears, the thunder of many hooves approaching fast. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the distinctive rhythm of Apache war ponies, their riders moving with the coordinated precision of a hunting party. She was trapped between the advancing warriors and the evidence of her latest kill, with nowhere to run and no allies to call upon. The irony was not lost on her. Cast out by her own people for showing mercy, she now faced death at the hands of their traditional enemies. The lead rider crested the rise above her canyon, his silhouette sharp against the blazing sky. Even at a distance, she could see the war paint on his face, the feathers in his hair, the proud bearing of a warrior in his prime. Their eyes met across the dusty expanse, and in that moment, Ayana felt the weight of destiny settling around her like a shroud. This was where her story would end, in the unforgiving wilderness that had become her home, surrounded by the bodies of men who had hunted her and facing warriors who had no reason to show her mercy. She straightened her shoulders and gripped her knife, preparing to meet her fate with the dignity of a warrior, even if she could no longer call herself Comanche. If this was to be her final battle, she would fight it on her own terms, with her head held high and her spirit unbroken. The Apache war party began their descent into the canyon, and Ayana whispered a prayer to the spirits of her ancestors, hoping that somehow, somewhere, they might forgive her for the choices that had led her to this moment. Chapter 4. The Warrior's Vision. The Apache war party descended into the canyon like shadows given form, their horses moving with the fluid grace of predators closing in on their prey. Ayana stood her ground beside the bodies of the bounty hunters, her knife gleaming in the harsh sunlight, her chin raised in defiance of the approaching warriors. But something was wrong with the scene unfolding before her. The Apache riders weren't whooping war cries or brandishing their weapons. Instead, they moved with the controlled precision of hunters who had already decided the fate of their quarry. Their leader, a man whose presence commanded attention even at a distance, raised his hand, and the entire party came to a halt just beyond rifle range. Ayana studied him with the trained eye of a warrior. He was tall and lean, with the weathered features of a man who had spent his life under the desert sun. War paint marked his cheekbones, and eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, but it was his eyes that held her attention. Dark and intelligent, they seemed to see through her defensive posture to something deeper beneath. "You are the one they call the Apache Ghost," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. His English was accented but clear, suggesting education beyond what most whites expected from a savage. "I am Comanche," Ayana replied, maintaining her fighting stance despite the futility of facing a dozen warriors alone. "My name is Ayana, and I am no ghost." The Apache leader urged his horse forward, moving slowly to show he meant no immediate harm. As he drew closer, Ayana could see the scars that marked his arms and chest, evidence of countless battles and the warrior's life he had chosen. But there was something else in his bearing, a quality she couldn't quite identify. "I am Nalnish," he said, using the Apache word for one who survives. "Among my people, I am known as a war leader, but today I come not to make war, but to understand." "Understand what?" Ayana asked, though she didn't lower her weapon. "Why a Comanche woman lives alone in the wilderness, killing white men who hunt her for bounty," Nalnish replied, his eyes taking in the scene of carnage around them. "Why she has been cast out by her own people, yet continues to fight for survival." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Ayana felt exposed, as if this stranger could see into her soul and read the story written there in blood and sorrow. "I chose compassion over loyalty," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saved a white child's life, and my people named me traitor." Nalnish studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he dismounted and approached on foot, his weapons remaining secured. The gesture was both brave and foolish. Within striking distance, even a wounded warrior could be dangerous. "You speak of choice," he said, stopping just beyond the reach of her knife. "But I see a woman who has had everything taken from her, yet refuses to surrender. I see a warrior who fights not for glory or revenge, but for the simple right to exist." "What do you want from me?" Ayana asked, confusion mixing with her wariness. "3 days ago, we raided a supply wagon," Nalnish said, his voice taking on a different tone. "Among the goods we captured was a letter written by a white woman in Fort Davis. She spoke of a mysterious Indian woman who had saved her daughter's life, risking everything to show mercy to a child." Ayana's breath caught in her throat. Mary, the little girl she had saved, had survived and reached safety. The woman wrote that she would never forget the kindness shown by the enemy who proved to be more human than those who called themselves civilized, Nalnish continued. She wrote that she prayed every night for the safety of the woman who had given her daughter back to her. Tears threatened to blur Ayana's vision, but she blinked them back. In all the months of exile and hardship, she had never known what had become of Mary. The knowledge that her sacrifice had not been in vain stirred something deep within her chest. When I heard the stories of the Apache ghost, Nalnish said, I knew I had to find you. Not to kill you, but to understand what manner of person would risk everything for a stranger's child. And what have you concluded? Ayana asked, her knife finally lowering slightly. That you are the kind of warrior my people need, he replied without hesitation. A fighter who has not forgotten what it means to be human. A woman who understands that true strength comes not from the ability to take life, but from the wisdom to know when to preserve it. The other Apache warriors had remained motionless throughout the exchange, but Ayana could sense their tension. Whatever their leader was planning, it wasn't what they had expected when they rode into this canyon. My band is small, Nalnish continued, but we are survivors. We have learned to adapt, to find new ways to live in a world that grows more hostile each day. We are not just warriors anymore. We are guardians of those who cannot protect themselves. What are you saying? Ayana asked, though she thought she was beginning to understand. I am saying that exile does not have to mean death, Nalnish replied. I am saying that sometimes the greatest warriors are those who have been cast out by their own people for refusing to harden their hearts. I am saying that you have a choice to make. He gestured toward the canyon walls, where the shadows were growing longer as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. You can continue to live alone, fighting for survival until the desert claims you or the bounty hunters succeed in their hunt, he said. Or you can ride with us and find a new purpose for the skills that have kept you alive. Ayana looked around at the desolate landscape that had been her home for 6 months. The loneliness, the constant danger, the gradual erosion of hope. All of it had worn her down like water-carving stone, but she had survived, and in surviving she had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. Your people would accept a Comanche exile? She asked. My people would accept a warrior who understands that our fight is not against all white men, but against those who would destroy everything we hold sacred, Nalnish replied. A fighter who knows that sometimes the greatest victory is in saving a life rather than taking one. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the promise of change. Ayana felt something stirring within her, not just hope, but the possibility of belonging somewhere again, of finding a place where her choices might be understood rather than condemned. I have nothing to offer but my weapons and my willingness to fight, she said. You have something more valuable than weapons, Nalnish replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. You have the heart of a mother, the soul of a protector. In these times, that is worth more than gold. As the Apache war party prepared to leave the canyon, Ayana took one last look at the shack that had been her home. It had been a place of survival, of loneliness, of desperate struggle, but it had also been the place where she had discovered who she truly was when everything else was stripped away. She mounted her horse and rode toward the warriors who had offered her a new chance at life, carrying with her the hard-won knowledge that sometimes the greatest courage was found not in following the expectations of others, but in remaining true to the voice of conscience, no matter the cost. The desert wind whispered through the canyon behind them, carrying away the last traces of her solitary existence and opening the path to an uncertain but hopeful future. Chapter 5. Finding Purpose in Belonging. The Apache camp, nestled in a hidden valley, protected by towering red rock formations that seemed to grow from the earth itself. As Ayana rode beside Nalnish through the narrow entrance, she was struck by the sense of organized activity that permeated the settlement. This wasn't the traditional Apache rancheria she had expected, but something different, a community that had adapted to survive in changing times. Women tended gardens, carved into terraced slopes, growing corn, beans, and squash alongside native plants that could thrive in the harsh climate. Children played between the wickiups, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. But what caught her attention most were the faces that turned to watch her arrival. Not all of them were Apache. "You're surprised," Nalnish observed, noting her expression as they dismounted near the center of the camp. "I expected," Ayana began, then stopped, unsure how to express her thoughts without giving offense. "You expected angry warriors plotting raids and revenge," he said with a slight smile. "Instead, you find families trying to build something that will last." An elderly woman approached them, her weathered face creased with lines that spoke of both hardship and wisdom. She moved with the careful dignity of someone whose age had brought respect rather than infirmity, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of a born leader. "Grandmother," Nalnish said, using the term of respect for an elder, "this is Ayana, the one I told you about." The old woman studied Ayana with the intensity of someone reading a story, written in scars and calluses. Her gaze took in the exile's weathered clothes, the weapons worn with familiar ease, the proud bearing that hadn't been broken by months of hardship. "So you are the woman who saved the white child," she said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The one who chose exile rather than compromise her conscience." "I am," Ayana replied, meeting the elder's gaze directly, "though I wonder if you see that choice as wisdom or foolishness." The old woman's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "I see a woman who understands that our children, all children, are our future, that the color of their skin matters less than the content of their hearts." She gestured toward the diverse group of faces gathered around them. "Here, we are not just Apache. We are Mexican women who fled abusive husbands, white settlers who were cast out for trading fairly with Indians, soldiers who deserted rather than participate in massacres. We are all refugees from a world that had no place for us." "And you lead them?" Ayana asked, though the answer was already clear in the deference shown by everyone around them. "I guide them," the elder corrected gently. "My grandson leads our warriors, but I help our community find its way. My name is Desba, and I have lived long enough to see that survival requires adaptation." Over the following days, Ayana began to understand the unique nature of this community. Unlike traditional Apache bands that relied primarily on raiding and hunting, these people had developed a complex economy based on trade, agriculture, and selective protective services. They provided security for Mexican merchants traveling through Apache territory, negotiated safe passage for settlers who treated them with respect, and served as intermediaries between various tribes and the territorial government. It was a delicate balance, requiring diplomacy as much as warrior skills. "You look troubled," Nalnish observed on her third evening in the camp. They sat by a small fire outside his wickiup, sharing a meal of roasted meat and corn cakes, prepared by his sister Itzel. "I am trying to understand my place here," Ayana admitted. "Among the Comanche, my role was clear. I was a warrior, a hunter, a protector. Here I see complexity that I am not sure I can navigate. Do you see that woman there?" Nalnish pointed toward a middle-aged Mexican woman who was teaching a group of children to weave baskets. "Her name is Rosa. She came to us 3 years ago, beaten half to death by a husband who thought his ownership of her included the right to abuse her." Ayana watched the woman's patient movements, the way she guided small hands in the intricate work of basket weaving. "She had no skills that seemed useful to a band of warriors," Nalnish continued. "She could not fight, could not hunt, could not scout, but she could heal, and she could teach, and she could love children who were not her own. Now, she is one of our most valued members." "And you think I'm like her?" Ayana asked. "I think you are like all of us," Nalnish replied. "Someone who has been broken by the world, but who chooses to heal rather than remain broken. Someone who has learned that strength comes in many forms." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young Apache warrior, his face flushed with excitement and concern. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver his message. Nalnish's expression grew serious as he listened, and Ayana felt the familiar tension of impending conflict settle over the camp. "What is it?" she asked, though she was already reaching for her weapons. Riders approaching from the south, Nalnish said, rising to his feet. 20 men, heavily armed, pushing their horses hard. They're not merchants or travelers. They're coming here with purpose. Within minutes, the camp had transformed from a peaceful settlement into a defensive position. Warriors took up positions among the rocks, while non-combatants gathered in the most protected areas. But there was no panic, no chaos, just the smooth execution of a plan that had clearly been practiced many times. Bounty hunters? Ayana asked, checking her rifle and estimating the range to the canyon entrance. Possible, Nalnish replied, or territorial militia. We've had reports of increased activity in the area. Someone may have finally decided we're too much of a threat to ignore. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Ayana found herself thinking of Mary, the little girl whose life had set her on this path. She wondered if the child was safe, if she was growing up in a world that would teach her to fear people like Ayana, or if she would remember the kindness of the woman who had saved her. Whatever happens, Nalnish said quietly, know that you have found your place among us. You are no longer alone. The words settled around Ayana like a warm blanket, filling a void she hadn't even realized existed. For the first time since her exile, she felt truly part of something larger than herself. Not just a band of warriors, but a community of survivors who had chosen to build rather than destroy. The riders crested the ridge above the valley, their silhouettes sharp against the darkening sky. Whatever they brought with them, violence, negotiation, or something else entirely, Ayana knew she would face it as part of a family that had chosen to accept her. The exile was over,